Map number 10. D.A. Ming Hun Yi Tu. Imagine unrolling a massive scroll of soft, ancient silk, its edges worn by centuries, its surface brushed with strokes of black ink that once glistened beneath lantern light in a palace long vanished from the earth. As the fabric unfurls, an entire world reveals itself, mountains rising like ghostly ribs, rivers snaking across continents with effortless precision, and coastlines stretching outward as if traced from the vantage point of a bird soaring impossibly high above the earth. This breathtaking artifact is called the Ming Hun Yi Tu, literally, the Great Ming Amalgamated Map. And it was created in the late 14th century during China's Ming dynasty. But what makes this map extraordinary is not merely its age or its beauty. It is the haunting question that historians cannot fully answer. How could a map made in 1389 portray so much of the world with such astonishing accuracy? For at a time when European maps still curled at the edges of myth, when vast swaths of Africa and the Middle East remained ambiguous territories on parchment, and when the Americas were still unknown to Europe, the Ming Hun Yi Tu presented a bold, shockingly coherent vision of the world. And it did so centuries before global navigation made such knowledge possible. But before we unravel the enigma of its precision, let us step back into the world that created it. A world of emperors, scholars, and cartographers who saw the earth not merely as a set of lands and seas, but as a cosmic body radiating harmony and celestial order. A world united by silk, diplomacy, and ambition. In the late 1300s, the Ming dynasty was rising from the ashes of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, determined not just to rebuild China's power, but to reassert its worldview, a worldview that placed the Middle Kingdom at the center of all existence. Yet unlike the isolationist stereotype that sometimes overshadows Chinese history, this era was one of extraordinary curiosity, cultural exchange, and intellectual hunger. Chinese scholars scoured the heavens with star charts. Astronomers calculated movements of planets with breathtaking accuracy. Explorers traveled the seas. Emissaries brought back stories of distant kingdoms. And from every corner of the known world, rare maps found their way into China's imperial archives. Among these were Korean maps, Mongol charts, Islamic world maps, and possibly even information echoing from far older traditions. Persian, Indian, and perhaps even remnants of ancient Greek geographic thought filtered eastward through trade networks. The Ming Hun Yi Tu was not simply drawn, it was synthesized, an intellectual fusion of countless cultures and knowledge streams, each contributing threads to an immense tapestry. But even this does not explain the most chilling detail. The map is far too accurate to be the result of medieval guesswork. Africa's outline is recognizable. The Middle East is proportionally correct. Korea and Japan appear in proper shape. Even parts of India and Southeast Asia seem geographically coherent. This level of accuracy should not have been possible in 1389, and so the mystery deepens. A map created without exploration? Historians have long debated a troubling possibility. Did China possess detailed knowledge of the world long before the legendary voyages of Zheng He? And if so, where did this knowledge come from? Some suggest that Mongol-era contact with Islamic cartographers introduced precise geographic data into East Asia. Others argue that the map preserves earlier, now lost Eurasian geographic traditions. But a small, provocative group of scholars even hint, quietly, carefully, that China may have inherited fragments of global knowledge predating even the classical civilizations we revere today. As you trace your eyes across the ancient silk, you find yourself wondering, were ancient societies far more globally connected than our textbooks admit? The Ming Hun Yi Tu invites this question, uncomfortably, insistently. Its coastlines whisper about journeys unrecorded. Its rivers imply expeditions forgotten. Its proportions hint at measurements taken with methods no one can fully reconstruct. And yet, for all its precision, the map reveals something just as fascinating. It is not perfect. Not at all. Africa's southern regions widen into an exaggerated bulge, revealing that the mapmaker was uncertain about lands below the equator. Europe is compressed, almost hesitant in its outline, as if its shape were known only by distant rumor. But this makes the accurate parts even more unsettling, because it means the mapmaker was honest where they lacked information and precise where knowledge was strong. This was no fanciful medieval sketch. It was a deliberate, careful geographic statement. RT, geography, and power merged into a single scroll. In Ming China, a map was never just a map. It was an assertion of cosmic order, of a world governed by harmony between heaven and earth. The Ming Hun Yi Tu's sweeping lines reveal not just geography, but philosophy. China sits at the center, not arrogantly but symbolically, because the mapmaker believed that civilization radiated outward from the heart of the world. Distances grow wider near the edges, reflecting both geographic uncertainty and the belief that lands far from China were spiritually and culturally remote. To the south, the shimmering mass of Southeast Asia winds across the silk like a dragon in motion. To the west, the curves of India jut into the sea with surprising confidence. And to the southwest, the Horn of Africa stretches outward, unmistakable even to a modern viewer. It is in these details that the true depth of the map reveals itself, not as a relic of ignorance, but as a staggering achievement, built atop centuries of information transmitted through trade, diplomacy, and ancient scholarship. The fragility of the world's memory. But perhaps the most haunting truth about the Ming Hun Yi Tu is not what it shows, but what it implies. That knowledge, no matter how advanced, can be lost as easily as it is gained. Wars can burn libraries, dynasties can fall, empires can forget what their ancestors once knew. And so this map survived against the odds, one of countless scrolls that once lay in imperial archives, now scattered or destroyed. It is like a whisper from a forgotten era, a message sent across 6 centuries, telling us that the world was once far more interconnected than we dare imagine. And as you stare at its ancient silk surface, you may feel something unusual, not merely admiration, but a kind of unease. Because if this map, created in 1389, contains knowledge that should have been impossible, what else has history forgotten? What other maps lie hidden, waiting to be uncovered? What truths about our world have we yet to rediscover? Map number 9. The Catalan Atlas. In the dimly lit chambers of the Royal Library of the Crown of Aragon, where dust floated like tiny lost stars beneath the wavering glow of oil lamps, and where the soft rustle of parchment seemed almost like the faint whisper of forgotten centuries, there once lay a thing so extraordinary that even the most hardened soldier or most seasoned scholar would find themselves pausing, breath held, heart stilled, as though before some sacred relic of unimaginable power. It was a map, but to call it merely a map would be a disservice to the strange and almost mystical force that emanated from its surface. For this vast creation, bound in 6 enormous sheets of vellum and painted with pigments that glittered softly like muted jewels, was less a chart of geography and more a portrait of the medieval imagination itself, an entire world condensed into color, script, symbol, and story, as though the maker of this artifact had attempted not to capture the earth, but to capture the dreams and fears of humanity. This breathtaking creation, known today as the Catalan Atlas of 1375, was born from the mind of a man whose life straddled multiple worlds. Abraham Cresques, a Jewish cartographer from the island of Majorca, a land where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim cultures collided like shifting tides, generating sparks of brilliance even in the midst of conflict and uncertainty. And it was under the command of King Peter IV of Aragon that Cresques set quill to parchment, shaping not merely a navigational aid, but an encyclopedia of medieval knowledge, an illustrated book of marvels, and a grand geographical poem that would come to define how Europe imagined the outer world in an age before the horizon had been conquered by sails or compasses or reason. To gaze upon this atlas is to feel transported into a mind that believed the world was vast yet intimate, dangerous yet full of promise, chaotic yet threaded with hidden order. The map opens outward like an unfolding saga, presenting not only continents but characters, not only rivers and mountains but legends and kingdoms, and the mysterious peoples who dwelled beyond the Mediterranean shores. It is a world where the physical and the mythical blend seamlessly, where deserts stretch like oceans of gold, where oceans curl like serpents at the boundaries of the known, and where the East, that shimmering and half-miraculous region beyond the horizon, calls to the viewer with all the allure of a forbidden story whose final chapter has never been told. Even before one reads a single word of its Gothic script, the eye is drawn irresistibly toward the figure of a king seated in solitary magnificence deep within the great sands of the Sahara. There he sits, robed, crowned, and holding a gleaming sphere of gold that catches the imagination like a spark thrown into dry tinder. This is Mansa Musa, the legendary ruler of the Mali Empire, who once journeyed across North Africa with so much gold that the economies of the lands he passed through trembled for years afterward. His presence on the map is not simply decorative, it is a declaration, a reminder that Africa was not, to the medieval mind, an empty frontier or a distant unknown, but a place of power, wealth, and uncharted majesty. Cresques paints him with reverence, allowing a single figure in a vast expanse to communicate the awe Europe held for stories of golden empires beyond the scorching desert sands. And yet, the desert around him is not empty. It seems alive with the idea of distance, of mystery, of perilous trade routes where caravans moved like drifting shadows beneath the gaze of an unforgiving sun. The Sahara on the Catalan Atlas is both a barrier and a bridge, a place that simultaneously discourages approach and fuels curiosity. It is a landscape that medieval Europeans could scarcely imagine, yet it pulses on the map with a vividness that suggests Cresques possessed information far more detailed than rumor alone. If one allows their gaze to drift eastward across the vellum, one enters a realm even more enchanting as the map reconstructs the fabled Silk Road in all its romance and complexity. Mountain chains rise in jagged sequences, painted with such delicacy that one can almost feel the chill of their perpetual snows. Rivers unwind across great distances in shimmering strokes of ink, as though guiding the viewer's eyes along caravan paths that once bore spices, silks, furs, porcelain, and ideas. Small illustrations portray merchants with camels laden with goods, travelers with windswept cloaks, and nomadic tribes whose existence was known to Europe only through fragmented tales carried by returning adventurers. Here, the influence of Marco Polo becomes unmistakable, for the Catalan Atlas incorporates not only the geography but also the wonder-filled stories from his travels, stories that painted Asia as a land of impossible cities, mythical beasts, and rulers whose wealth rivaled the dreams of kings. Cresques uses Polo not as a strict guide, but as a prism through which the Middle Kingdom and its surrounding territories could be refracted into 100 alluring shapes, merging reality with fantasy in a way that medieval audiences found irresistible. Farther east, although one must remember that on medieval maps, east is often depicted at the top, for it was believed to be the direction of paradise, there sits, enthroned with serene authority, the great Khan himself. Though the Mongol Empire had fractured by the time Cresques painted his atlas, the memory of its might still dominated European thought. The Mongols had once commanded nearly the entire breadth of Eurasia, forging an empire that connected continents in a way no previous power had ever achieved, and their dominion had opened paths for trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that transformed the known world. Cresques honors this legacy by portraying the Great Khan with dignity rather than fear, a choice that reveals an uncommon respect for Asian civilizations at a time when Europe often viewed foreign cultures through a distorted lens of ignorance and superstition. In the Catalan Atlas, the Mongol courts are depicted as centers of power, wealth, and intrigue. The cities of Cathay rise on the map in detailed illustrations that suggest a fascination with the East that transcends mere curiosity. They reflect a deep admiration, even a longing, for the unimaginable sophistication European travelers described. Between these portraits and landscapes, the map is crowded with annotations, lines of text that describe customs, natural wonders, political realities, and strange beliefs the medieval world attributed to distant peoples. The writing does not simply label places, but tells stories, turning the atlas into a great sprawling narrative. This was not a map made merely to guide sailors. It was a map made to guide minds. The text sprawls like marginalia in a sacred manuscript, beckoning the viewer to lean closer, to read about cities where the walls glittered with porcelain, or about islands guarded by monstrous creatures, or about lands where rivers shimmered with gold dust. Returning westward, past Asia and back toward the Mediterranean, one is struck by a sudden shift from mythic expansiveness to crisp precision. For here, Crescus draws upon the most advanced cartographic knowledge of his age. Majorca, his homeland, was renowned for its portolan charts, nautical maps of exceptional accuracy that mariners trusted as their most precious tools. And so, the Mediterranean in the Catalan Atlas is not a place of fantasy, but a place of exactitude. Coastlines are sharply defined, islands are positioned with care, and the famous windrose lines that radiate across portolan maps stretch across the sea like the threads of some invisible spider's web, guiding the imaginary sailor from port to port. This juxtaposition is part of what makes the Catalan Atlas so mesmerizing. It blends the known and the unknown with effortless grace. It transitions from scientific precision to mythic speculation, from political intelligence to travelers' tales, constructing a world that is at once real and unreal, logical and dreamlike. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where the boundaries of knowledge were fragile, where information from distant lands arrived distorted by memory, imagination, and fear. The Catalan Atlas captures that delicate, shimmering uncertainty with unmatched beauty. As one continues to study the map, one becomes aware of a deeper truth beneath its surface. Cresques was attempting something far more profound than simply recording geography. He was constructing a world view. The atlas is filled with symbols of power, images of kings, descriptions of religious customs, and narratives about the character of foreign peoples. It implies a world of interconnected destinies where kingdoms rise and fall according to the whims of fate, and where even the most remote lands have stories worthy of being preserved in ink and gold. Yet the most haunting aspect of the Catalan Atlas is not simply its beauty, nor its detail, nor even its storytelling. It is the knowledge that the world that produced it is gone. Majorca's Jewish community, which had been one of the great engines of medieval map-making, was violently uprooted only a few years after the map's creation. The court that commissioned the atlas dissolved into political shifts, trade routes changed shape, empires collapsed, and the medieval worldview, so vividly captured here, gave way to the age of exploration, where maps grew colder, more mathematical, less enchanted. And so the Catalan Atlas remains as a survivor, a witness to a vanished age. It is a relic of a time when the world was still half mysterious, when the horizon was a place of fear and promise, when knowledge moved slowly through the hands of merchants and travelers, and when the act of drawing a map was not merely a scientific endeavor, but a spiritual and imaginative one. It reminds us that humanity once lived with an exquisite tension between wonder and ignorance, curiosity and dread, and that in this tension, some of the most beautiful creations of the medieval mind were born. To hold the Catalan Atlas, or even to gaze upon it in a museum case, is to feel the echo of that vanished world, to sense a breath from the past drifting across the centuries, whispering about kings who ruled golden empires, about merchants whose tales spanned continents, about deserts filled with silence and danger, and about seas that invited exploration even as they threatened death. It is a reminder that before we flatten the world into grids and coordinates, We painted it with stories, dreams, and legends. And perhaps in doing so, we understood something about the world that we have since forgotten. For the Catalan Atlas is not just a map, it is a memory of how humanity once looked at the earth, not with certainty, but with awe. Map number 8. The Vinland Map. If you were to step into a quiet archive late at night, when the lights have dimmed to a faint golden haze, and the only sound is the soft hum of climate control machines protecting fragile manuscripts from decay, you might feel an uncanny presence lingering in the air. Not a ghost, but something subtler, colder, and somehow far more unsettling. The presence of a mystery so persistent, so defiant of explanation, that it has commanded the attention of scholars, explorers, and dreamers for decades. In a room filled with manuscripts that have slept through centuries, one document in particular seems unable to rest, as though its very existence demands that it be questioned, doubted, challenged, and yet, curiously, never forgotten. It is a document that whispers a question capable of overturning one of the greatest narratives of the modern world, and that document is the Vinland Map. To look at the Vinland Map for the first time is almost disappointing in its simplicity. It is not colorful like the Catalan Atlas, nor expansive like the Ming Hun Yi Tu, nor decorated with grand kings or mythical beasts. Instead, it appears modest, a delicate outline of continents, traced in faint, almost hesitant ink, with slender inscriptions that seem to shrink from the eye, as though the map itself is unsure whether it wants to be seen or to vanish back into the shadows where it once hid. Yet it is precisely this unassuming appearance that gives the map its strange, haunting power, for on its pale surface lies a landmass that should not exist, a shape protruding from the western edge of the known world, an island that medieval Europeans were never supposed to know. And if the map is genuine, it means that Europeans recorded the existence of North America long before Columbus ever set sail. But to understand why this one fragile line of ink has generated so much debate, one must journey back through nearly 1,000 years of speculation, myth, and scattered fragments of historical evidence. For long before the Vinland Map surfaced, there were already whispers, old sagas preserved in the cold northern air of Iceland, stories passed down through generations of Norse families who claimed their ancestors had sailed across a vast icy ocean and reached a strange new land where wild grapes grew and forests stretched endlessly beneath the northern sky. These were the sagas of Leif Erikson and the Viking voyages to a place they called Vinland. For centuries, scholars quarreled over whether these stories were truth or legend, fact or Nordic fantasy. Then, in the 20th century, long after the sagas had faded into the realm of literature, the ruins discovered at l'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland proved that the Vikings had indeed reached North America around the year 1000. The discovery was groundbreaking, and yet the sagas alone could not answer the deeper question. Did medieval Europe as a whole know of this distant land, or did the knowledge remain confined to a handful of Norse explorers, their stories quietly swallowed by time? It was into this historical uncertainty that the Vinland Map suddenly emerged, appearing almost like a ghost from the shadows of medieval history. In 1965, during a moment of scholarly excitement that bordered on feverish enthusiasm, the map was presented to the world by Yale University. It was said to be a mid-15th century document, the same century that saw the rise of Prince Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese voyages down the coast of Africa, and the growing hunger for expansion that would soon launch Europe into the era of discovery. And here, supposedly, was a map created before Columbus ever left Spain, boldly showing a landmass unmistakably resembling part of North America, labeled with the ancient Norse name Vinland. It was a revelation that seemed poised to rewrite the history of exploration. The ink lines of the Vinland Map were faint but purposeful, tracing the contours of Europe, Asia, and Africa in a style reminiscent of other medieval Mappa Mundi. But the true shock lay on the western edge of the parchment, where a small but distinct island appeared, an island far across the Atlantic, impossible to place within the known world of the 1440s. The moment scholars laid eyes upon this detail, a wave of exhilaration swept across the historical community. If the map was authentic, it would mean that Columbus was not discovering a new continent, but rediscovering one long forgotten. It would mean that the Norse voyages had been acknowledged, recorded, and integrated into the intellectual geography of Europe centuries earlier than anyone had believed. It would mean that the world was never as blind, never as ignorant, never as enclosed within its own misconceptions as we once assumed. But even as excitement surged, so too did doubt, creeping like a thin mist over the edges of the parchment. For the Vinland Map did not come from a long, well-documented line of custody. Its origins were obscured by secrets, rumors, and gaps in its history that raised alarm bells among those who knew how often forgeries had crept into the antiquities market. The map was said to have been discovered in Europe after World War II, during a period when stolen artifacts and forged treasures moved through the shadows like fallen leaves carried by a bitter wind. The manuscript to which it was supposedly attached was authentic, but the map itself had no clean provenance, no record of having been seen before the mid-20th century. Scholars examined the map under microscopes, analyzed the ink, studied the script, compared the shapes of coastlines, and debated endlessly whether the faint outlines on the parchment could truly belong to the 1400s. The arguments grew heated, splitting historians into camps that hardened like opposing armies on a battlefield of evidence. Those who believed in the map's authenticity pointed out that its depiction of Greenland was strikingly accurate for its supposed time of creation. The map shows Greenland as an island, something not conclusively known through European sources until much later. They argued that only someone familiar with Norse geographical knowledge could have drawn such a feature. Moreover, the use of Latin inscriptions, stylistic choices in the script, and the integration of the map with the accompanying manuscript suggested that the creator had access to European scholarly traditions. But critics countered with a quieter, deadlier force: chemical analysis. Tests performed on the ink revealed traces of modern titanium dioxide, a pigment invented in the 20th century. If the tests were accurate, they seemed to expose the map as a forgery crafted long after the medieval period. Yet even these scientific results refused to close the matter definitively, for chemical tests themselves became the subject of scrutiny and reinterpretation. Some argued that contaminants could have entered the parchment through conservation processes. Others suggested that the tests were flawed, incomplete, or misinterpreted. The Vinland Map thus entered a strange liminal space, neither authenticated nor debunked, living in a kind of suspended twilight where each new study only deepened the mystery instead of resolving it. But beyond the scientific arguments lies a deeper question, one that touches on the very nature of history itself. Why does the Vinland Map captivate us so powerfully? It is not simply because it might prove that Europeans knew of America before Columbus, though that would certainly shift our understanding of the past. Nor is it merely because the map's existence would elevate the Norse sagas from historical curiosities to widely recognized chronicles of early transatlantic exploration. The real reason the Vinland Map exerts such a magnetic pull on the imagination is that it challenges the narrative structure of the world we believe we know. It suggests that history is not a neat sequence of discoveries, but a chaotic accumulation of forgotten journeys, fleeting memories, and lost documents. It implies that knowledge can emerge in one era only to vanish in the next, erased not by fire or conquest, but by the silent erosion of time. To contemplate the Vinland Map is to confront a possibility that feels both thrilling and unsettling: that medieval Europe was more connected, more informed, and more curious than we usually imagine. Perhaps news of distant voyages traveled farther than we assume. Perhaps whispers of unknown lands circulated in monastic libraries, in merchant guilds, in the private notes of scholars who pieced together rumors from Norse sailors, fishermen, and travelers who had glimpsed the edges of a wider world. The Vinland Map, whether genuine or not, embodies this tantalizing potential. It is a symbol of forgotten knowledge, knowledge that might once have flickered through the dim halls of medieval learning before vanishing into silence. And yet, there is something else about the map that captures the heart more than the mind. It is the fragility of it, the faint, trembling lines that seem to hover between existence and erasure, as though aware that they are the battleground of a controversy that has lasted decades. There is something almost human about the way the ink fades into the parchment, as though time itself is trying to swallow the map back into the void from which it emerged. One cannot help but feel that the map is weary of being questioned, weary of being held up to microscopes and subjected to chemical tests, weary of being asked to justify its own existence. It feels like an old witness who might at any moment slip into silence forever. Imagine a medieval scholar, hooded, contemplative, hunched over a parchment under dim candlelight, hearing perhaps faintly and indirectly tales from Nordic sailors who spoke of lands across the sea, lands where timber grew tall and fresh water ran clear. Imagine him sketching a faint line on a sheet of vellum, unsure whether to believe the tale but unwilling to ignore it, drawing a shape not with confidence but with cautious curiosity. Perhaps he labeled that shape Vinland, not knowing whether future generations would laugh or marvel, not knowing that centuries later, scholars would argue about that single line of ink with a fervor usually reserved for theological debates. Whether this scenario is true or merely a romantic projection is impossible to know, and that, in a sense, is the spell of the Vinland Map. It invites not only investigation but imagination. For in the end, the map stands at the intersection of fact and dream, history and possibility, skepticism and wonder. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that our understanding of the past is always incomplete, always subject to revision, always vulnerable to disruption by a single artifact pulled from the shadows. Even if the Vinland Map is proven to be a forgery, completely without question, it will remain an object of extraordinary significance, for it has shaped decades of inquiry into the Norse presence in the New World, pushed scholars to reinterpret old evidence, and deepened public fascination with the Viking voyages. And if, by some chance, the map is genuine after all, then it represents one of the most astonishing losses and rediscoveries in the history of cartography, a lone surviving voice from a tradition of knowledge that otherwise vanished like smoke. The true power of the Vinland Map lies not in whether it is real or false, but in the way it reveals the porous boundaries of history. It reminds us that knowledge does not travel in straight lines, that truth can be hidden in improbable places, and that the world has always been larger, stranger, and more interconnected than our textbooks suggest. Standing before it, one feels not certainty, but curiosity, not finality, but invitation, an invitation to look deeper, to search further, to question what we think we know about the past. And as you gaze upon that faint outline labeled Vinland, you may feel the same stirring that countless scholars have felt, a quiet, electric thrill that suggests the world once held secrets we are only now beginning to rediscover, and that somewhere beyond the reach of our assumptions, beyond the comfort of established narratives, lies a history far older and far more mysterious than we dare imagine. Map number 7. The Kangnido Map. If you were to imagine the world as it appeared to a scholar in the early 15th century, before the great ships of Europe had sailed beyond familiar waters, before the cartographic revolutions of the Renaissance, before the coordinates of the globe had been pinned into scientific precision, you might envision a small, enclosed universe, a world compressed by uncertainty, a world bordered not by oceans, but by imagination. And yet, in a quiet corner of East Asia, far from the centers of European map-making and far from the maritime ambitions that were beginning to stir in Portugal and Spain, a group of Korean scholars and officials produced a map so vast, so intricate, and so uncannily accurate for its time that even modern historians sometimes stare at it in disbelief, wondering how a world so young in its global awareness could have produced something so astonishing. This is the Kangnido Map of 1402, a map that seems to exist outside the normal flow of history, as though it were not created but revealed. The Kangnido Map is not small. To behold it is to confront a world that feels almost overwhelming in its ambition. Hundreds of place names scatter across the parchment like constellations. Rivers twist and coil like living veins. Mountains rise in jagged arrangements, forming the skeletal structure of continents. And through it all, there flows an almost supernatural sense of order, as though the map makers understood not merely where the lands lay, but how they connected, how the world breathed as a single unified organism. This is one of the earliest world maps created in East Asia that attempts to show the entire known world in one great sweep. And it does so with a confidence that might seem impossible for its era. Yet the true miracle of the Kangnido Map lies not merely in its scale, but in its synthesis, for it is a map born of three worlds. It incorporates the geographical knowledge of China, Korea, and the Islamic world, merging traditions that had evolved independently across centuries into a single cartographic vision. Chinese scholarly knowledge contributed detailed information about East Asia, its provinces, its rivers, its coastlines, its inner geography. Korea added refinements, corrections, and a sense of precision that Korean scholars were renowned for. But the most astonishing component comes from Islamic geography, transmitted eastward through trade routes, diplomatic missions, and the flow of manuscripts along the vast arteries of the Silk Road. Islamic cartographers had access to knowledge from ancient Greek geography, Persian traditions, Indian calculations, and Arab scientific advances, creating a sophisticated understanding of Eurasia and Africa. And in 1402, Korean scholars wove these threads together with breathtaking artistry. As you look upon the Kangnido Map, one detail leaps out immediately: Africa. Africa, drawn in 1402, appears with a shape that nearly mirrors its modern proportions. Its eastern bulge is recognizable, its western curve is clear. The continent stretches farther south than one would ever expect for a map created decades before Europeans rounded the Cape of Good Hope. How Korean scholars possessed this knowledge remains a subject of debate. Some believe they incorporated Islamic maps derived from earlier Greek traditions, passed through the intellectual centers of Persia and Arabia. Others argue that the extraordinary accuracy might reflect knowledge brought by travelers whose names history has forgotten. But one thing is certain: Africa on the Kangnido Map stands far beyond anything produced in medieval Europe at the time, a reminder that global knowledge traveled in ways our textbooks rarely acknowledge. And next to Africa lies the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East, drawn with a kind of clarity that reveals how deeply the Islamic world had penetrated Korean scholarly consciousness. The positioning of the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Nile, and the broad outlines of the Indian Ocean all reflect a level of geographical sophistication that was rare outside Islamic cartography. Korean scholars in 1402 did not simply copy a foreign map. They interpreted, integrated, and refined it, merging it with East Asian traditions to produce something entirely new. It is as though the map itself is a dialogue, a conversation between civilizations that never met directly, yet somehow understood one another through the universal language of geography. Then there is China. China dominates the map, not merely in size, but in detail. Thousands of names are inscribed within its borders, marking cities, rivers, provinces, mountains, and administrative regions with an almost obsessive meticulousness. This reflects the deep influence of the Ming dynasty's geographical traditions on Korean scholarship. China, in the Kangnido worldview, is not just a landmass, it is the center of civilization, the axis around which the world turns. The mapmakers enlarged China deliberately, believing that importance and size must reflect one another. It is a reminder that maps are never neutral. They are expressions of worldview as much as they are representations of land. Still, even with its enlarged scale, the Chinese portion of the map demonstrates impressive accuracy. The Yellow River flows in its ancient course. The Yangtze curves gracefully toward the sea. The coastal outline, while not perfect, is surprisingly coherent. Cities are positioned in ways that suggest Korean scholars had access to official Chinese geographic surveys and administrative records. Korea itself, just to the east of China, is drawn with special care, reflecting national pride and the desire to present the peninsula with clarity and respect. The placement of mountains, the shape of coastlines, and the arrangement of provinces reveal a familiarity that could only come from intimate knowledge. It is a portrait of a homeland rendered with affection as much as precision. Japan appears next. Its islands arranged in an elongated chain that reflects both geographic truth and artistic interpretation. Japanese knowledge had also flowed into Korea, though less extensively than Chinese knowledge. Still, the Kangnido mapmakers attempted to present Japan with the best information available, giving it a form that, while imperfect, captures its general shape better than many European maps of the same period. The inclusion of Japan demonstrates the Korean desire to portray the entire East Asian world in harmonious relationship, a vision of interconnected realms rather than isolated nations. But perhaps the most mysterious feature of the Kangnido Map lies not in Asia or Africa, but in its faint, ambiguous representation of Europe. Europe, relegated to the western edge of the map, appears distorted, compressed, almost shy. This may reflect limited direct knowledge, as Korea's connections to Europe were distant and mediated through several layers of cultural transmission. Yet even here the map surprises. Italy is recognizable as a peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula makes an appearance. The British Isles float above the European mainland like two drifting seeds. These shapes are imperfect, yet they reveal something extraordinary. That Korean scholars in 1402 had at least a vague understanding of Europe's geographic form, long before Europeans understood East Asia with similar clarity. The Kangnido Map is thus both a map and a worldview. It captures not only geography, but the relationships through which knowledge traveled across the Eurasian world. It reminds us that cartography is not merely the result of exploration, but the result of communication. Even in the early 15th century, long before global navigation, before transatlantic voyages, before the printing press broadened intellectual exchange, the world was already interconnected through networks of merchants, diplomats, scholars, and envoys. Knowledge crossed mountains, deserts, seas, and cultural boundaries with a persistence that defies the idea that medieval civilizations were isolated or ignorant. Yet the awe inspired by the Kangnido Map does not come only from its accuracy. It also comes from its ambition. It was created at a time when the concept of a world map was rare, when many civilizations saw geography through narrow regional lenses. The very idea that Korean scholars attempted to depict the entire known world, its continents, kingdoms, and cultures, reveals a bold intellectual curiosity. The map reflects a desire to understand humanity in its totality, to place Korea within a grander stage, to envision a world far larger than immediate experience. This curiosity is deeply moving, for it shows that even in an era before globalization, before international travel, before scientific measurement, people sought to imagine the whole world as a connected tapestry. But like all ancient artifacts, the Kangnido Map is also a survivor. Many maps from East Asia's medieval period have been lost, burned in wars, destroyed in invasions, dissolved by humidity, or simply decayed into dust. The survival of the Kangnido Map feels almost miraculous, as though it resisted destruction through some quiet determination, carrying its message across 6 centuries to a modern world that often underestimates the intellect and global awareness of earlier civilizations. It challenges the simplistic narrative that Asia lacked global curiosity or that Europeans alone pushed the boundaries of geographical knowledge. Instead, it suggests that East Asian civilizations were deeply engaged with the world beyond their shores, absorbing ideas from faraway lands and integrating them into their own knowledge systems. The map's very existence forces us to reconsider the interconnectedness of the ancient world. It is tempting to imagine that medieval Korea was a remote, isolated kingdom, concerned only with its own borders. But the Kangnido Map tells a different story, a story in which Korea serves as a crossroads of ideas, synthesizing knowledge from China, Central Asia, the Islamic world, and even Europe. It is a story of intellectual openness, of curiosity, of the willingness to bridge worlds. This sentiment radiates through every line of ink on the map's surface. And yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Kangnido Map is what it symbolizes, the fragility of human knowledge. The information it contains about Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and even Europe reflects scholarly traditions that once flourished across the Eurasian continent, but have largely vanished. Much of the geographic knowledge that reached Korea through Islamic sources no longer exists in any surviving form. The manuscripts that carried this information may have been lost in war, burned in libraries, or allowed to decay. But echoes of that lost knowledge survive through the Kangnido Map, preserved like a fossil of intellectual history. As you contemplate the map's sweeping vision, you feel an undeniable sense of wonder. You sense a world that was far more connected, far more dynamic, far more intellectually vibrant than the stereotype of a dark or isolated Middle Ages suggests. You sense the ghosts of forgotten travelers who carried stories across continents. You sense the scholars who, with ink-stained fingers and dimly lit rooms, tried to stitch together a picture of a world they could never fully see. You sense the ambition of a generation who believed that even if they could not travel across the world, they could understand it, and that the act of understanding was itself an expression of profound humanity. To look upon the Kangnido Map is to feel the vastness of the human desire to know. It is to recognize that our ancestors were not merely observers of their world, but seekers, restless minds who hungered for knowledge, who gathered fragments of truth wherever they could find them, who blended the geographic traditions of multiple civilizations into a masterpiece that defies its time. It reminds us that long before the age of exploration, long before the rise of global empires, long before the modern world took shape, there were people who dared to imagine the entire world at once, who dared to believe that understanding the earth was a sacred duty, a way of honoring both the heavens and the human spirit. And as you stand before the Kangnido Map, its ink fading yet defiant, its details fragile yet monumental, you realize that it does something almost miraculous. It opens a window into a world where knowledge was treasured, where curiosity transcended borders, and where the shape of the earth was not merely drawn, but dreamed. It whispers that our world has always been larger and more interconnected than we assume, and it leaves you with a lingering, humbling thought, that in the quiet rooms of ancient scholars, surrounded by scrolls and whispers and flickering candlelight, the world was already being charted, not with ships or compasses, but with imagination. Map number 6. The Hereford Mappa Mundi. Imagine entering an ancient cathedral, its stone walls echoing with the weight of centuries, its towering arches holding not just air and shadow, but the silent memory of countless prayers breathed into its vastness. Within such a place, protected not by guards or glass at first, but by reverence, there once hung an object so strange, so profound, that it seemed less like a map of the world and more like a window into the medieval mind itself. This was the Hereford Mappa Mundi, a masterpiece of imagination and belief created in the late 13th century and one of the largest, most detailed, and most haunting medieval maps ever crafted. Even today, standing before it feels like standing at the threshold of a lost worldview, peering into an era when geography, theology, myth, and fear blended into one vast tapestry. The Hereford Mappa Mundi is enormous, not merely large in dimension, but overwhelming in density. It stretches nearly 5 feet across, a circular vision of the world drawn on a single sheet of vellum so massive that one can still trace the contours of the calfskin it was made from. The map is not content to depict rivers and mountains. Instead, It attempts to capture the entire spiritual and physical universe as understood by medieval Christendom. It is a portrait not of the earth, but of existence. Every inch is crowded with ink, cities, rivers, peoples, animals both real and imagined, biblical scenes, kings of forgotten empires, monstrous beings whispered of in ancient lore, and pathways stretching across continents like threads of meaning woven through chaos. To understand the Hereford Mappa Mundi, one must enter the medieval imagination, an imagination shaped not by science, but by scripture, not by measurement, but by meaning. For the map is not oriented with north at the top, as modern viewers might expect. Instead, it turns the world upward toward the east, the direction of paradise, the rising of the sun, the place where the story of humanity begins. And at the very top of the map, enthroned majestically above all creation, is Christ himself, reigning over the world with divine authority. His presence reminds the viewer that this is not simply a record of geography. It is a moral and theological document, a guide for understanding the world's place within God's plan. Below Christ, at the center of the map, lies Jerusalem, the navel of the world, the point from which medieval Christians believed the earth unfolded and to which all spiritual journeys ultimately returned. Jerusalem is not drawn with geographic precision but with symbolic prominence. Its placement is an anchor, holding the entire map together. From this sacred center, the world spreads outward like a great living manuscript written by both human hands and divine intention. As you let your eyes glide across the vellum, you begin to notice that the continents, though distorted by modern standards, are arranged with care. Asia stretches across the top half of the map, large and mysterious, colored in subtle tones that have faded with time but still retain their quiet dignity. Here lies the Garden of Eden, depicted with rivers flowing outward in directions that defy physical geography but obey the logic of Scripture. Adam and Eve stand naked beneath a tree, the serpent coiled around its branches, frozen in the moment that humans first grasped the knowledge of good and evil. This scene anchors the medieval belief that the world is not merely a physical space, but a moral stage. Farther west in Asia, strange creatures appear: griffins, dragons, cannibalistic tribes, humans with faces in their chests or dog-like heads. These are not the inventions of the Hereford mapmakers. They come from classical sources, from Roman and Greek authors whose stories filtered into medieval Europe as fragments of misunderstood reports of real peoples or as metaphors that took on a life of their own. In the Hereford worldview, these monstrous races inhabit the fringes of the earth, not because the mapmakers believed the world was monstrous, but because they believed the unknown was inherently charged with moral and spiritual meaning. To them, the edges of the world were places where the order of creation began to fray, where the laws of God grew thin and gave way to the strange, the dangerous, the wondrous. As you move across Asia toward the right-hand side of the map, the depiction of India is particularly striking. To medieval Europeans, India was a land of marvels, a place of spices, jewels, enormous wealth, and strange fauna. The elephants on the map are drawn with an innocence that suggests awe rather than accuracy, their bodies more symbolic than anatomical. The region is filled with notes describing exotic peoples and incredible wonders, showing how India captured the medieval imagination as a realm of magic and abundance, even if its geography was poorly understood. The mapmakers knew that India lay somewhere beyond the familiar world, and so they filled it with the wonders described in ancient texts and travelers' tales. As the map curves downward, Africa emerges, though not in the recognizable shape we know today. It is drawn as a long, tapering landmass, its outline bulging and twisting in ways that reflect not ignorance, but the blending of multiple, sometimes contradictory sources. Africa was known to Europeans not just through trade routes, but through biblical narratives, classical geography, and rumors carried from caravans that had traveled across deserts, stretching farther than imagination could grasp. The creatures that appear here, satyrs, wild men, strange hermaphroditic beings, reflect the belief that Africa, like Asia, held the unknown in abundance, that the lands farthest from Europe were filled with mysteries both fascinating and frightening. But amid these fantastical elements, real places appear as well. Alexandria, known for its ancient library; Carthage, the once great Phoenician city; the Nile, drawn branching across the continent in ways that suggest ancient Greek theories rather than direct observation. The blending of reality and myth reveals how medieval Europeans constructed their understanding of the world, not by separating fact from fiction, but by layering stories, scriptures, and fragments of experience into a single worldview. Europe occupies the lower left portion of the map, smaller than Asia, yet drawn with more familiarity. Here the details shift from the fantastical to the known. Cities like Rome, Paris, and London appear, though their positions are distorted by the map's symbolic structure. The British Isles float off the coast, drawn with a simplicity that belies their growing importance in medieval geopolitics. Europe is portrayed as the realm of Christendom, a land of order and civilization, in contrast to the wild expanses of Asia and Africa. Yet even here, myth intrudes: dragons in the far north, monstrous beings near the edges, and notes describing ancient legends that medieval scholars accepted with the same seriousness as historical records. One of the most remarkable features of the Hereford Mappa Mundi is the way it integrates time into space. Unlike modern maps, which depict land as static, this map includes stories from biblical history, ancient myths, and classical literature. Noah's Ark rests on a distant mountain. The Tower of Babel stretches upward in defiance of divine command. Scenes from the life of Christ are drawn alongside depictions of Alexander the Great, illustrating the medieval belief that sacred and secular history intertwined continuously. The world on the map is not simply the world of geography. It is the world of human memory, divine intervention, and moral instruction. It is a map meant not to guide travelers on roads, but to guide souls on journeys of understanding. In this sense, the Hereford Map is as much a sermon as a cartographic artifact. It teaches that the world is ordered by God, that places carry significance beyond their physical boundaries, and that the moral universe is reflected in the spatial universe. The map's creators did not worry about accuracy as we understand it. Their goal was not to represent the earth as it physically existed, but to represent it as a moral and spiritual landscape. Every river, every mountain, every city, every creature serves a purpose, not to inform the geographic mind, but to shape the religious imagination. Yet despite its symbolic nature, the Hereford Mappa Mundi is not without genuine geographic knowledge. It incorporates Roman traditions, Anglo-Saxon information, and even hints of Arabic geography. The Mediterranean is drawn as a central hub of civilization, its sea stretching like a vast horizontal ribbon across the center of the map. Italy is recognizable as a boot-shaped peninsula, even as its proportions are distorted. The Holy Land is mapped with a surprising degree of detail, revealing how important pilgrimage routes were to medieval society. The Red Sea is colored in bright red ink, a striking aesthetic choice that reflects the belief that its waters turned red from the blood of Pharaoh's soldiers during the Exodus. Details like these underscore that the map is an artistic interpretation of the world through the lens of faith, shaped not by surveying tools but by scripture, stories, and symbolism. One of the most haunting features of the map lies at its outer edges, where the world dissolves into spirals of text and depictions of monstrous races. These beings, the Ptolemaic with faces in their chests, the Cyopods who shade themselves with their massive feet, the Cynocephali who bark like dogs, represent the medieval fascination with the fringes of the earth. To the mapmakers, these creatures were not merely curiosities. They were moral lessons. Their monstrous forms symbolized humanity without divine law, societies untouched by the gospel, people living at the margins of creation where chaos and order collided. The edges of the Hereford Mappa Mundi thus function as warnings as much as depictions, reminders that the world's boundaries were places where human understanding faltered and faith became necessary. Despite its overwhelming density and symbolic richness, the Hereford Map has a quiet, almost hypnotic beauty. The ink, though faded, still curls with elegance. The colors, though muted, still glow with traces of medieval craftsmanship. The vellum, though scarred by time, still carries the faint warmth of the living creature from which it was made. It feels alive, as though the world it depicts is breathing faintly beneath the surface. And as you gaze upon it, you begin to feel the same mixture of wonder and unease that medieval viewers must have felt, a sense that the map reveals something profound about the world, something that transcends physical boundaries. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Hereford Mappa Mundi is that it has survived at all. It endured wars, reforms, iconoclasm, political upheaval, and the simple, relentless passage of time. For centuries it hung in Hereford Cathedral, exposed to dust, candle smoke, and the hands of the curious. It could easily have been lost, discarded, or destroyed, and yet it endured as though protected by the very reverence that surrounded it. Today it rests behind glass, preserved with care befitting its significance, and yet its presence remains as powerful as ever. It is not merely a relic, it is a testament to how humans once understood the world. To stand before the Hereford Mappa Mundi is to confront the difference between how we see the world and how medieval people saw it. We see geography as measurable, mappable, defined by longitude and latitude, by coastlines and borders. They saw geography as a moral text, a spiritual diagram, a canvas upon which the story of humanity was painted. Their world was smaller physically, but infinitely larger in meaning. This map, more than any other, captures that lost worldview, a world where every river had a purpose, every city a moral significance, every creature a lesson to impart. And so the Hereford Mappa Mundi invites us not simply to observe, but to reflect. It asks us to remember that the world is shaped not only by land and water, but by ideas, beliefs, myths, fears, and hopes. It reminds us that maps are not only tools for navigation, but mirrors reflecting the minds that created them. It whispers that long before our modern obsession with accuracy and precision, humans sought something far deeper, to understand their place in a universe filled with mystery. And perhaps as we look upon this ancient, sprawling vision of the world, we realize that mystery still lies at the edges of our own maps, waiting to be rediscovered. Map number 5. The Turin Papyrus Map. If you were to enter the barren, unforgiving deserts of ancient Egypt, where wind carves the sandstone into whispering ridges and the sun strikes the earth with such relentless intensity that even shadows seem to retreat, you might imagine that this landscape, this ocean of sand and stone, has always been untouched by the careful hand of cartographers. And yet, beneath the dust of centuries, hidden within the ruins of forgotten workshops and the tombs of artisans who served the pharaohs, there lies an artifact so astonishing in its precision, so startling in its sophistication, that its very existence forces us to rethink what we believe about the ancient world. This is the Turin Papyrus Map, created around 1150 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses IV, a map that predates the birth of Greek science, the rise of Rome, and the earliest medieval atlases by nearly 2,000 years. It is the oldest surviving topographic map in human history, a map that reflects not myth, not imagination, but a measured, empirical understanding of the land that feels almost modern in its clarity. To look upon the Turin Papyrus Map is to enter a world that existed more than 30 centuries ago, yet still speaks to us with a voice that feels uncannily clear. Painted on papyrus with strokes of black, red, pink, and ochre, the map stretches across the ancient scroll in a flowing panorama of mountains, quarries, roads, and the dry riverbeds of Wadi Hammamat. It is not a symbolic depiction, not a stylized cosmological diagram, not a map of gods and myths like those that would emerge in later cultures. Instead, it is a practical, functional guide created for a real purpose: to help a royal expedition navigate the rugged terrain east of the Nile Valley in search of prized stone. This map, unlike the medieval maps of Europe or the mythic atlases of Asia, does not attempt to depict the entire world. It focuses on a single region, but in doing so, it achieves a precision and realism that feels astonishing for its age. The map was created for a quarrying expedition sent by Ramesses IV, who sought the beautiful speckled stone known as bekin, prized for statues, sarcophagi, and royal monuments. The ancient Egyptians, masters of stonecraft, needed detailed knowledge of where to find this rock and how to move teams of workers, donkeys, and supplies through treacherous, winding valleys. And so an Egyptian scribe, whose name history has not preserved, took up brushes dipped in mineral pigments and created a map that blended artistry with engineering. This anonymous artisan, likely a skilled draftsman attached to the royal works, did not merely sketch symbolic outlines. He recorded the terrain with remarkable accuracy, marking hills with shaded slopes, quarries with precise notations, roads with straight lines, and even the location of gold deposits known to the Egyptians for millennia. When you gaze at the Turin papyrus map, you can see the mountains rising in careful strokes, each ridge given texture with stippling and shading that conveys not only their shape, but their relative height. The hills appear almost alive, curling across the papyrus like petrified flames, and yet the arrangement is not decorative. These are real geological formations placed in approximately correct positions and proportions. Scholars who have compared the map to the actual terrain of Wadi Hammamat have marveled at the accuracy. This was not guesswork. This was field work. And then, in the center of the map, flows a long, sinuous band of pinkish color representing the ancient dry riverbed, the wadi, along which the expedition would travel. The scribe traced this wadi with a delicate hand, capturing its bends and curves, its sudden forks and narrow stretches. The accuracy of this riverbed's shape reveals a mind trained not only in writing and drawing, but in observation. The map was a tool for navigation, a guide for the teams of laborers, soldiers, and overseers who would make the journey through this perilous region. But perhaps the most remarkable features on the map are the notations indicating the locations of specific quarries and mines. Written in hieratic script, the cursive form of ancient Egyptian writing, the annotations identify the types of stone found in each place, the hardness of the rock, the methods of extraction, and the distances between one point and the next. This level of detail is staggering. In an age long before compasses, long before longitude and latitude, long before the scientific methods of Ptolemy or Eratosthenes, the Egyptians were creating topographic maps that showed not only what the land looked like, but how it could be used, how it could be traversed, and where its valuable resources lay hidden. The map also depicts gold mines, sites that were once among the most coveted treasures of the ancient world. The Egyptians had been mining gold in the eastern desert since the earliest dynasties, using both simple and sophisticated methods. The presence of gold deposits on the Turin papyrus map reveals not only the geographic knowledge of the Egyptians, but also the economic importance of the region. Gold was the lifeblood of royal power, the gleam on the temples, the adornment on statues of gods. To map the mines was to map the very veins of wealth that allowed pharaohs to shape their civilization. Yet for all its practicality, the map is also beautiful. The colors, soft reds, warm ochres, deep blacks, create a landscape that feels almost timeless. The mountains, though stylized, convey motion, texture, and depth. The wadi winds across the papyrus like the spine of a serpent. The quarries are marked with geometric forms that speak of human intervention, the quiet struggle between earth and tool. The map is both functional and artistic, practical and poetic. And there is something else that sets this map apart, something subtle yet profound: the perspective. Unlike many ancient maps which flatten the world into symbolic shapes or abstract forms, The Turin Papyrus map uses what might be called an oblique perspective, a kind of bird's-eye view that combines elevation and plan in a single image. The mountains are shown from the side, yet placed within a broader topographic layout. The roads and riverbeds are drawn from above, yet integrated seamlessly with the more sculptural depictions of hills. This blending of viewpoints suggests a sophisticated understanding of how to represent complex terrain on a flat surface. It reveals that ancient Egyptian artists, who had long mastered multiple perspectives in their hieroglyphic and mural art, were capable of applying the same visual logic to mapping. And they did so with a clarity that modern viewers find striking. As you study the map, you begin to feel the weight of the journey it was meant to guide. You imagine the expedition moving slowly through the desert, following the winding wadi, stopping at waypoints marked on the papyrus. You picture overseers consulting the map beneath the blazing sun, checking distances, interpreting landmarks, guiding their men along the safest path. You sense the dust, the heat, the silence of the valleys, broken only by the sounds of footsteps and the scraping of stone tools. This map was not a theoretical exercise. It was an instrument of survival and organization. And yet, despite its practical purpose, the map survived not in a workshop or quarry, but in a tomb. It was discovered in the 19th century as part of a larger collection of papyri that had been buried with an artisan or official, someone who likely participated in the quarrying expeditions or managed such operations. Why was it buried? Perhaps because the map was considered valuable enough to accompany its owner into the afterlife, or because it was placed in the tomb accidentally, bundled with other documents. Whatever the reason, its survival is an improbable gift, a window into the mind of an ancient engineer whose precise knowledge would otherwise have been lost. The Turin Papyrus map also tells a larger story about the Egyptian worldview. To the Egyptians, the desert was not a void or an empty expanse. It was a sacred landscape filled with dangers, opportunities, and the presence of gods. The eastern desert, where this map is set, was especially significant. It was home to deities associated with minerals, craftsmanship, and the harsh beauty of the natural world. The mountains were places of divine presence, the quarries sites of transformation where raw stone became statues, sarcophagi, and temples dedicated to gods and kings. By mapping this terrain, the Egyptians were not merely recording geography, they were recording a landscape imbued with spiritual and economic significance. But the map also reveals something more subtle, an ancient understanding of empirical observation. The Egyptians were not merely myth-makers, they were observers, measurers, and recorders of the natural world. They surveyed land for taxation, measured fields after the flooding of the Nile, aligned pyramids with astronomical precision, and mapped quarry sites with care. The Turin Papyrus map stands as one of the most extraordinary examples of this scientific spirit. It demonstrates that long before the Greeks developed geometry, long before Rome built its vast road networks, long before medieval cartographers sketched the shape of Europe, the Egyptians had already mastered the art of visualizing land. It is humbling to realize that this map predates Ptolemy's influential Geographia by more than 1,000 years. It predates the earliest surviving Babylonian maps by centuries. Yet in its realism and detail, it surpasses many maps that came long after. It is a reminder that history does not progress in a straight line, that knowledge can be gained and lost, that ancient civilizations often possessed insights we underestimate. It also reminds us how fragile such knowledge can be. The fact that only one map of this kind has survived from ancient Egypt suggests that the Egyptians may have produced many more maps, maps of the Nile, maps of cities, maps of military campaigns, maps of other quarries, that simply did not withstand the erosion of time. Papyrus, though durable for its age, is vulnerable to humidity, insects, and fire. What we possess is likely only a small fraction of what once existed. As you contemplate the map, you might imagine the scribe who created it, seated cross-legged in a workshop beside a jar of pigments, the desert wind drifting through an open doorway, the sound of distant workers shaping stone blocks. You imagine him dipping his brush into ink, marking out the flowing line of the wadi, shading the mountains, writing notes in hieratic script with practiced ease. Perhaps he consulted earlier sketches made during survey trips, or perhaps he walked the land himself, measuring distances in paces, noting landmarks, memorizing the shapes of rock formations. The precision of the map suggests a man who understood the land intimately. His brushstrokes, still visible after more than 3,000 years, capture not only geography but the pulse of human effort in a harsh environment. The Turin Papyrus map also invites us to reconsider the ancient Egyptian understanding of space. Unlike many ancient cultures that saw maps as symbolic representations, the Egyptians were capable of creating maps that corresponded directly to real terrain. This suggests a linear sense of distance, a capacity for scaled representation, and an awareness of spatial relationships. The idea of mapping for them was not abstract but practical. They used maps to organize labor, manage resources, and plan large-scale projects. The map reflects a civilization that valued precision, order, and the ability to transform the land through human effort. Ultimately, the Turin Papyrus map is more than just a record of a quarrying expedition. It is a statement about what ancient Egyptians believed was worth recording, the land that sustained their civilization, the resources that built their monuments, the roots that connected them to the heart of their kingdom. It is a testament to the unity of art, science, labor, and spirituality in ancient Egypt. For the Egyptians, mapping the land was an act of understanding the world and their place within it. It was an assertion of knowledge, control, and reverence. As you let the map's details sink in, the winding wadi, the carefully shaded mountains, the marked quarries, the ancient script, you realize that this map is as alive today as it was 30 centuries ago. It continues to speak, quietly but insistently, across the gulf of time. It tells us that ancient Egypt was not a civilization lost in myth, but one grounded in observation, craftsmanship, and the desire to master the world through understanding. It whispers that long before modern technology emerged, before satellites scanned the Earth from orbit, human beings were already mapping their world with skill, imagination, and a profound sense of purpose. And in the end, the Turin Papyrus map becomes something more than an artifact. It becomes a reminder of the enduring human impulse to record, to measure, to navigate, to dream of landscapes beyond the horizon. It reveals that the ancient world, far from being primitive, possessed a complexity, intelligence, and curiosity equal to our own. It invites us to reconsider what we call ancient, to see it not as remote or archaic, but as part of a continuous human story, a story in which the desire to understand the land beneath our feet is as old as civilization itself. Map number 4. The Madaba Map. If you could travel back in time to the early centuries of the Byzantine Empire, walking through the arid lands of ancient Palestine, where the scent of desert dust mingles with faint traces of incense drifting from distant chapels, you might reach a small provincial town called Madaba. And if you stepped into one of its modest churches, unimposing from the outside, built of pale stone like so many others scattered across the Holy Land, you would discover something extraordinary beneath your feet. There, shimmering in muted reds, blacks, golds, and deep earthy tones, embedded into the floor like a window into another world, lay the Madaba map. Not just a mosaic, not just a symbol of faith, but the oldest surviving large-scale map of the region that gave birth to Christianity. A map that has astonished historians, archaeologists, and pilgrims alike for more than a century. To look at the Madaba map is to witness how faith, geography, and memory intertwined in the minds of early Christian communities. Created in the 6th century CE during the reign of Emperor Justinian, the map was not meant to be stored in a scroll, folded on a shelf, or used by travelers on dusty roads. It was meant to be walked upon. It lay beneath the feet of worshippers in the Byzantine Church of St. George, forming part of the floor like a sacred carpet woven from stone and belief. Imagine those who once entered the church, peasants, fishermen, monks, weary travelers, stepping onto this mosaic, unaware that the ground on which they stood carried the memory of an entire region. The map was a bridge between earth and heaven, a reminder that the landscape surrounding them, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Jericho, the Jordan River, was not merely geography but the stage of sacred history. The Madaba map was constructed from more than 2 million tiny tesserae, each a small fragment of colored stone or glass, each carefully placed by master artisans whose names have vanished into the past. These artisans did not create an abstract design. They crafted a topographical vision more vivid and detailed than any surviving map from the era. Spread across the floor, the map once stretched nearly 25 meters long, though only fragments remain today. Yet even in its incomplete form, it is breathtaking in both intricacy and intention. The map centers on the Holy Land, with particular emphasis on Jerusalem, and what a Jerusalem it was. Unlike medieval maps that compress the city into symbolic outlines, the Madaba map depicts Jerusalem with startling detail. You can see the city walls, the gates, the towers, the central colonnaded street called the Cardo Maximus, and even the rotunda of the Holy Sepulchre, rendered as a gleaming circular structure crowned by a dome. It is one of the oldest surviving images of the city after Emperor Constantine transformed it into a Christian pilgrimage center. The mosaic does not simply name Jerusalem, it reveals it. You can almost imagine pilgrims entering the church in Madaba, looking down and recognizing the holy city not through imagination, but through direct visual representation. And this was no accident. The map's creators knew that pilgrims would rely on such images to understand the region they longed to visit. For many Christians living in faraway lands, Cappadocia, Egypt, Rome, Armenia, the Holy Land was a place known only through scripture and stories. The Madaba map offered them something tangible, a glimpse of the real terrain, a guide to the sacred geography of their faith, a visual journey through the life of Christ and the unfolding drama of biblical history. The Jordan River winds across the mosaic in graceful, curved strokes, resembling a living entity rather than a simple line. Its waters flow from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, which is depicted in deep, shimmering hues. Boats float on the water, and fish swim within it, marking it as a place of abundance and movement. The river is not drawn as a mere geographical feature. It is portrayed as a lifeline, a sacred artery that connects the events of the New Testament. East of the river lies the land of Moab, with towns like Dibon and Aroer, labeled in elegant Greek script. West of the river lie the towns of Judea, each represented by miniature buildings, rooftops, and walls. Bethlehem stands proudly, a place of profound meaning for the Christian world. And scattered around the region are countless villages, fortresses, and settlements, some known to Scripture, some known to Roman and Byzantine administration, and some known only through local memory. The map stretches far beyond the Holy Land. Portions depict the Nile Delta, the Mediterranean coastline, and even parts of the Sinai Peninsula. But its purpose was not merely to show the world, it was to show the world through the lens of Christian faith. The Madaba map was part of a long tradition of creating visual aids that helped believers understand biblical narratives. Priests used it as a teaching tool, pilgrims used it as a spiritual orientation, and for the local community it was a reminder that their land was holy, not merely historically, but eternally. And yet, for all its spiritual significance, the Madaba map is also an extraordinary work of geographical precision. When archaeologists first studied it in the late 19th century, they were astonished to discover that many of the map's depicted locations aligned with actual sites. Villages long lost to the sands of time re-emerged through the mosaic's guidance. Roads known only through ancient texts materialized in recognizable trajectories. Churches, monasteries, and fortresses that had collapsed centuries earlier were rediscovered thanks to the map's meticulous detail. In this sense, the Madaba map is not merely a religious artifact, it is an archaeological treasure. Consider the city of Ascalon, for example, depicted with curved fortification walls that match known ancient architectural patterns. Or the town of Neapolis, modern Nablus, shown as a structured settlement even before many medieval maps acknowledged its existence. The mosaic includes dozens of place names that provided vital clues to scholars attempting to reconstruct the region's Byzantine-era geography. Modern excavations have repeatedly confirmed the accuracy of the map's representations. This makes the Madaba map not only the oldest surviving map of the Holy Land, but also one of the most accurate ancient maps ever discovered. What makes the map especially fascinating is the balance between symbolic representation and realistic depiction. Buildings are stylized yet recognizable. Cities are presented as collections of gates, walls, and roofs, each hinting at architectural features known from archaeological evidence. Mountains and hills are represented through color gradients rather than literal outlines. The Dead Sea is elongated but still convincingly rendered, with boats traveling across its surface and fish swimming in its waters, despite the fact that the Dead Sea cannot support fish in reality. Such details reveal how the map blends observation with theological and narrative intention. The map's orientation itself is a reflection of faith. Unlike modern maps aligned to the north, the Madaba map is oriented to the east, toward the rising sun, toward Eden, toward spiritual resurrection. To the people who walked upon it, east did not simply mean a direction. It meant the origin of life, the promise of salvation, the light of God entering the world. Thus, Jerusalem, lying roughly at the center of the map, becomes not merely a geographic hub, but the spiritual heart of the world. Despite the beauty and significance of the Madaba map, it did not survive unscathed. Time, earthquakes, iconoclasm, and the collapse of the original church destroyed parts of the mosaic. Only fragments remain. The edges of the once grand panorama are broken and incomplete. Yet what remains is enough to reconstruct its original grandeur. When archaeologists rediscovered the map in 1884 beneath layers of dust and debris, they realized they were staring at one of the most important map-related artifacts ever found. It immediately reshaped our understanding of Byzantine cartography, pilgrimage traditions, and the spatial consciousness of early Christians. But beyond its scholarly value, the map continues to speak to those who encounter it today. There is something deeply moving about standing over a mosaic that has witnessed nearly 14 centuries of history, empires rising and falling, religions flourishing and dividing, wars and peace, devastation and renewal. The mosaic floor beneath your feet was once walked upon by worshippers whose prayers echoed through the same space, whose eyes drifted across the same images, whose understanding of the world was shaped in part by what they saw beneath them. And as you imagine those ancient worshippers, you begin to see the map not only as a tool of geography or archaeology, but as a spiritual artifact. It captures a worldview in which the landscape is more than land. It is a living testament to divine presence. Every building, every road, every river was infused with sacred meaning. The map was not meant to instruct the mind alone. It was meant to move the soul. Yet the map is also a testament to the ingenuity of early cartographers who combined artistic skill with geographic knowledge. It reveals a culture that understood the importance of place, not just physical place, but place as identity, place as memory, place as theology. For early Christians, mapping the Holy Land was akin to mapping their faith. Understanding where the stories of Scripture unfolded helped them feel connected to the divine narrative. It gave them a sense of belonging within a cosmic story that stretched across time and space. The Madaba map whispers that geography was once a sacred language, written not with lines and coordinates, but with stones arranged in patterns meant to reflect the order of the world as God intended it. It reminds us that ancient maps were not mere tools, they were experiences. They invited viewers to journey not only across land, but across stories, across beliefs, across the profound sense of connection shared by early Christian communities. And so even today, when scholars and pilgrims visit the Church of St. George in Madaba, They do not merely analyze the map. They stand in silence. They feel the weight of centuries beneath their feet. They imagine the countless lives that have passed over the mosaic. And for a moment, they too become part of its story. In the end, the Madaba map is more than an artifact. It is a testament to human longing, the longing to understand our world, to place our stories within it, to make sense of the land that shaped us. It reveals that mapping is not simply an act of drawing lines, but an act of remembering, of preserving the places where the sacred and the earthly meet. And in its tesserae, still gleaming faintly after 14 centuries, we glimpse not only the geography of the Holy Land, but the geography of the human spirit. Map number 3. The Putinger Map. Tabula Peutingeriana. If you were to unroll the Putinger map in a quiet room, far from the noise of the modern world, far from the rumble of vehicles that trace the very routes the map once envisioned, you would feel as though you were unrolling time itself. The map does not open like a typical map. It stretches, unfurls, elongates, revealing a world not as we see it, but as the Romans moved through it, a world defined not by geography, not by coastlines, not by topographic realism, but by roads, networks, connections, and the relentless movement of people, armies, merchants, and ideas. To stand before the Putinger map is to step into the mind of an empire that measured its greatness not in land alone, but in its ability to bind vast distances into a single functioning organism. This ancient map, known formally as the Tabula Peutingeriana, is perhaps the most extraordinary map of antiquity, for it is not a representation of the world. It is a representation of empire. The first thing you notice about the map is its shape. It is long, absurdly long, stretching nearly 7 meters from end to end, while standing only about 33 centimeters tall. It resembles a ribbon, a parchment serpent coiling through time, a strip of the earth flattened into something that looks, at first glance, almost impossible to understand. This distortion is deliberate. The map is not meant to depict land in proportional scale. Instead, it compresses north-south distances and expands east-west distances to highlight the thing the Romans valued most, the roads that connected their world. The Putinger map is a road map in the truest sense, a guide for those who traveled the empire's vast network of highways, the arteries and veins through which Roman civilization pulsed. Originally created around the 4th or 5th century CE, though its roots stretch back to even earlier centuries of Roman cartographic knowledge, the map as we know it today is a medieval copy, created in the 12th or 13th century. Yet despite the centuries between the original and the copy, the map's spirit remains unmistakably Roman. It is filled with thousands of place names, cities, towns, rest stops, forts, ports, and stations, interconnected by thin red lines representing the roads. Every stretch of road is marked with distances measured in Roman miles. Every settlement on the map has a purpose. And scattered across the parchment are miniature illustrations, buildings with columns and arches, towers and fortifications, symbolic depictions of cities that once stood as centers of power. As your eyes travel along this elongated landscape, you begin to realize that the map does not simply depict roads, it depicts life. You see Rome not as a sprawling city, but as a symbolic cluster of towers and a golden-roofed temple, radiating lines like sunbeams into every direction. The heart of the empire pulses outward. Roads stretch from Rome like nerves extending from a central mind. Each line carries the memory of soldiers marching, merchants guiding carts laden with goods, pilgrims seeking shrines, envoys traveling toward distant frontiers, messages carried by swift couriers who galloped across the empire's expanse in relays. The map extends far beyond the borders of Rome's classical empire. On its western edge lies Britain, flattened and stretched like a narrow strip, its towns strung along the length of the island. Gaul appears next, filled with stations and waypoints. Hispania, with its mountains and mines, is compressed but meticulously labeled. To the east, Italy sprawls prominently, not because of accuracy, but because Italy was the beating heart of the Roman world. The Italian peninsula curves gracefully, exaggerated in width but accurate in its connections. Naples, Pompeii, Florence, Ravenna, and countless other cities appear like beads on a necklace, each linked by the great Roman roads that once defined the empire. As you move farther east, the map crosses into Illyricum and the Balkans, filled with cities whose names echo faintly in modern ears: Sirmium, Singidunum, Thessalonica. The roads here trace jagged paths, revealing the complicated relationships between mountain regions and administrative centers. Then the map enters Greece, a place drawn not with geographic precision, but with an almost poetic density of names, for Greece's ancient cities were legendary even in Roman times. Corinth, Athens, Sparta, all appear, each connected to the next by thin red lines, like the threads of a spider's web spun across history's fabric. But it is when the map crosses into Asia Minor that its meaning deepens. Here, the roads continue with the same relentless consistency, revealing the Roman obsession with infrastructure. The cities of Anatolia, from Ephesus to Ancira to Iconium, appear along routes that once carried commerce and conquest. One can almost imagine the caravans laden with spices, silk, incense, and gemstones, following these ancient lines toward the heart of the empire. And then, as you move even farther east, the map begins to bridge worlds that the Romans knew only through trade and distant diplomacy. Mesopotamia appears, the land between rivers, where Babylon and Nineveh lie, names that whispered of ancient empires long before Rome's rise. The Euphrates and Tigris are shown as brown, twisting lines, bending strangely under the pressure of the map's unnatural proportions. Yet despite the distortions, the map captures the essential truth of the region's importance. It was a crossroads, a region where cultures collided, where merchants from India, Persia, and the Mediterranean exchanged goods and stories. The far eastern end of the map stretches into regions the Romans barely understood, but still included. Persia, Bactria, India, even hints of Sri Lanka and China appear, not with accuracy, but with inclusion. To the Romans, the world was vast, but the road system made it feel conquerable. The map reflects this worldview, Rome at the center, roads spreading like veins toward the unknown. The inclusion of distant lands speaks to the Roman ambition to imagine the world as something connected, even if not fully controlled. The Ptolemaic map also includes the great marvels of the ancient world. Alexandria appears prominently, its legendary lighthouse depicted as an elegant tower. Antioch, one of the great cities of the Hellenistic world, is shown with architectural flourishes. Constantinople, though still young when the Roman original was made, appears as the rising center of an empire shifting eastward. Carthage is marked as a symbol of Rome's greatest rival, conquered but not forgotten. Each city's illustration is stylized, yet iconic, designed not for accuracy but for recognition, like theater masks representing places instead of characters. The map is also filled with geographic features, the Mediterranean Sea, stretched like a horizontal band across the entire length. The Nile, flowing southward into lands filled with symbols of deserts, crocodiles, and ancient temples. The Red Sea, painted in vivid red ink. The Alps, drawn like wrinkled, jagged folds. In the Roman mind, these features were not obstacles but elements of a world rendered navigable through the empire's road system. And yet, perhaps the most fascinating thing about the Ptolemaic map is its underlying philosophy. It depicts the world as a system of connectivity. It reveals how the Romans understood empire, not as a collection of territories, but as a network. Roads were the lifeline. Roads made the empire governable. Roads made trade possible. Roads made war efficient. Roads allowed culture to spread, religion to travel, law to extend its reach. The map is essentially a visualization of the Roman mind, ordered, connected, and focused on movement. If you trace your finger along the red lines, you begin to feel the pulse of the ancient world, You imagine messengers racing from province to province, carrying news that might shape the fate of the empire. You imagine merchants journeying from Alexandria to Rome, from Trier to Aquileia, from Carthage to Antioch. You imagine legions marching steadily along roads paved with stone and purpose. And you realize that the map does not simply depict a road network, it depicts an entire world view in which the empire existed as long as the roads stayed intact. Yet the Ptolemaic map is also a survivor, and its survival is miraculous. The original Roman map was lost centuries ago. The medieval copy that exists today narrowly escaped destruction during wars and neglect. It was rediscovered in the 16th century by the humanist Conrad Ptolemaic, after whom the map is now named. But even after its rediscovery, it was nearly forgotten again, tucked away in archives where few eyes could appreciate its significance. Only in the last century has the map received the attention it deserves, recognized as one of the most important cartographic documents in human history. The map also reveals how deeply the Roman infrastructure shaped later civilizations. Medieval pilgrims, merchants, and armies still used Roman roads long after the empire's fall. Many modern roads in Europe follow the same paths. The Ptolemaic map is, in many ways, a blueprint for the movement of Western civilization. It shows how people traveled, how goods moved, how power flowed. It is not simply a relic, it is a silent architect of modern Europe. When you stand before the Ptolemaic map, you feel the presence of a world that was once unified by stone, discipline, and ambition. The map feels alive, humming with the faint echoes of countless journeys, each represented by a tiny segment of red line. And as you contemplate its long, narrow form, you begin to understand that the Romans did not imagine their world as static. They imagined it as dynamic, constantly in motion. Movement was the essence of civilization. And in the end, this is what the Ptolemaic map reveals, more than anything else. A world knitted together not by borders, but by roads. A world held together not by walls, but by pathways. A world where the measure of greatness was not how much land could be claimed, but how far that land could be traveled. It is a map that whispers across the centuries that the greatest strength of an empire is its ability to connect its people, its cities, its ideas. And in that sense, the Ptolemaic map is not only a relic of the Roman past, it is a vision of all human civilizations, forever seeking paths that lead us toward one another. Map number 2. The Ptolemaic Maps. If you close your eyes and imagine the ancient world long before the printing press, long before compasses guided ships across oceans, long before modern science measured the Earth with satellites and precision instruments, you might envision a world painted in fragments, isolated kingdoms, scattered empires, and scholars struggling to understand the shape of the land beyond their immediate horizon. Yet among the ruins of that distant past, amid the scrolls preserved in crumbling libraries, and the whispers of ancient learning carried across continents by merchants and philosophers, there emerges a figure whose influence quietly dominated geography for nearly 15 centuries. That figure was Claudius Ptolemy, a mathematician, astronomer, geographer, and thinker whose work shaped the way humanity envisioned the world for longer than any other cartographer in history. And the maps created from his monumental book Geographia, the Ptolemaic maps, stand as some of the most powerful and consequential maps ever made. To understand the significance of the Ptolemaic maps, one must imagine Alexandria in the 2nd century CE, when Ptolemy lived. At that time, Alexandria was the beating heart of intellectual life in the Mediterranean, a city where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Roman cultures intertwined, where the legendary Library of Alexandria gathered knowledge from across the world, and where scholars attempted to comprehend the cosmos through mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and empirical observation. Ptolemy was part of this extraordinary intellectual environment, and his work reflects the ambition of a civilization that sought not simply to understand the world, but to measure it. Ptolemy's Geographia, written around 150 CE, was not merely a book of maps. It was a scientific treatise, a manual that explained the mathematical principles behind mapping a spherical Earth onto a flat surface. Ptolemy understood, as Eratosthenes had centuries earlier, that the world was round. But Ptolemy went further. He developed coordinate systems, projections, and methods for calculating latitude and longitude. He provided precise coordinates for more than 8,000 locations across the known world. And though many of these measurements were imperfect, the conceptual framework he provided was revolutionary. For the first time in history, the world could be drawn not as a symbolic diagram or a mythical landscape, but as a measurable, mathematically constructed representation of reality. Yet for all his brilliance, Ptolemy never drew a map himself. At least no map survived from his own hand. Instead, he left instructions for how maps should be drawn, and it was scholars centuries later who turned his descriptions into images. The earliest surviving Ptolemaic maps date to the Byzantine and medieval Islamic periods, with the most influential versions emerging during the Renaissance, when European scholars rediscovered Ptolemy's text and used it to construct maps with unprecedented precision for their time. These maps, shaped by his coordinates and projections, became the standard reference for understanding the world from the 1400s to the 1600s, guiding explorers, influencing explorers, and shaping the geographical imagination of Europe as it expanded into the unknown. To gaze upon a Ptolemaic map is to witness a strange fusion of accuracy and error. On one hand, the Mediterranean is depicted with remarkable precision, its coastlines, islands, and ports reflecting centuries of Greek and Roman seafaring knowledge. Italy appears nearly correct in outline, though slightly misshapen. Greece's intricate shorelines reveal an intimate familiarity with the Aegean's countless islands. The Black Sea resembles its real shape more closely than most medieval maps manage. North Africa's Mediterranean coast is depicted as a long, stable curve, stretching from Egypt to the Atlantic with surprising confidence. And yet beyond these familiar regions, the map begins to drift into distortion. India stretches farther east than it should. Sri Lanka appears enormous, almost the size of India itself. The shape of Africa curves downward and eastward, reflecting Ptolemy's belief that the Indian Ocean was enclosed by land, a belief that persisted for over 1,000 years and influenced European thought until explorers finally disproved it. The southern parts of Africa vanish into uncertainty, replaced by speculative landmasses that reveal more about ancient philosophy than ancient geography. East Asia is condensed, with China appearing as a narrow slice of land squeezed between the edges of the map and the mountains of Central Asia. The Caspian Sea is depicted as a long, horizontally oriented body of water, defying its true north-south axis. The British Isles float like compact tilted shapes far smaller and more compressed than reality. Despite these errors, the Ptolemaic maps were revolutionary in their structure. They used a grid. They used projections. They offered a consistent system for placing locations in relation to one another. And most importantly, they presented a world governed by measurable rules rather than mythic imagination. Ptolemy's system allowed cartographers to imagine lands they had never seen, to calculate distances between cities, to envision trade routes, to plan voyages. His maps were not perfect, but they were scientific. They replaced speculation with method. They created order. For medieval Europeans, the rediscovery of Ptolemy's Geographia in the early 1400s was akin to rediscovering a lost oracle. When a Greek manuscript of the text arrived in Florence in 1406, scholars pored over it with astonishment. Here was a work far more advanced than anything produced in medieval Europe. Renaissance humanists translated it, copied it, and used it to reconstruct the ancient world with mathematical precision. Soon, mapmakers such as Nicholas Germanus produced lavish illuminated atlases based on Ptolemy's instructions, filling the pages with elegant maps that radiated scientific authority. These maps spread rapidly across Europe, influencing not only scholars, but also navigators, merchants, and princes. Ptolemy's depiction of the Indian Ocean as enclosed by land had profound consequences. European explorers believed that Africa extended infinitely eastward, wrapping around to connect with Asia. Only when Portuguese explorers like Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 did this ancient misconception finally collapse. Yet even after this discovery, Ptolemaic maps remained influential because their mathematical foundations provided the best framework available for global mapping. Christopher Columbus himself used Ptolemy's calculations, misinterpreting them, to argue that Asia lay far closer to Europe than it actually did. In this sense, Ptolemy's influence indirectly contributed to the European voyages that eventually led to the discovery of the Americas. The Ptolemaic maps also reveal something profound about the ancient world's intellectual reach. Ptolemy drew upon Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Persian, and possibly Indian sources. Traders, sailors, diplomats, and scholars had transmitted geographic knowledge across continents for centuries before Ptolemy synthesized it. The maps demonstrate how interconnected the ancient world truly was. They show that long before the modern era, civilizations communicated, exchanged knowledge, and imagined a world far larger than their immediate surroundings. Yet the maps also reveal the limits of that interconnectedness. The enclosed Indian Ocean suggests that even the greatest minds of antiquity could be misled by incomplete data. The exaggerated size of Sri Lanka reflects reliance on sailors' reports rather than direct measurement. The distortions of East Asia reveal that cultural exchange with China, though robust through trade, lacked precise geographic transmission. The southern regions of Africa vanish because Roman knowledge did not extend far enough into the continent. The Ptolemaic maps are therefore not only representations of the ancient world, they are representations of ancient knowledge itself, with all its strengths and limitations. But beyond their accuracy or lack thereof, the maps carry a deeper significance. They represent humanity's attempt to grasp the entirety of the world through reason. While earlier maps expressed myth, religion, and symbolism, Ptolemy's maps expressed science, logic, and mathematical structure. They were a turning point in human history, marking the beginning of modern cartography, even though they were created nearly 2,000 years ago. They reveal the moment when the world ceased to be a mysterious expanse defined by gods and monsters, and instead became a measurable space defined by coordinates and calculation. To imagine the creation of Ptolemy's maps is to picture a scholar seated in a dimly lit room filled with scrolls, instruments, and charts. He dips his pen into ink and draws carefully, translating numbers into shapes. He calculates the length of a degree of latitude, the curvature of the earth, the projection necessary to flatten a sphere onto parchment. He writes down the coordinates of ports, islands, mountain ranges, and cities. He compares sources, weighs conflicting reports, chooses what seems most logical. His maps are born not from observation alone, but from synthesis, a combination of empirical data, inherited knowledge, and mathematical imagination. And when you examine a Renaissance-era Ptolemaic map, you feel the weight of that intellectual lineage. You see the grid lines stretching across the page like the skeleton of the world. You see the continents shaped not by artistic whim, but by adherence to coordinates. You see the names of distant places recorded in Greek script, each carrying the echo of ancient voices. These maps are not merely images, they are memories encoded in ink, memories of the ancient world's attempt to know itself. But the Ptolemaic maps are also haunted by their errors. Their enclosed ocean misled explorers. Their underestimated circumference of the earth emboldened Columbus to attempt a voyage that would have been impossible if he had known the true distance to Asia. Their distortions shaped colonial maps for decades. They represent both the power and the limitation of human knowledge. They reveal that even the most brilliant intellectual systems can be flawed, and that those flaws can ripple across history in unexpected ways. As you gaze upon a Ptolemaic map, you might feel a mixture of admiration and unease. Admiration for the genius behind it, the mathematical elegance, the ambition to map the world. Unease at the distortions, the assumptions, the mistakes frozen into its structure. And yet this duality is what makes the maps so deeply human. They are the product of a civilization trying to understand a world far larger than itself, reaching outward with reason while constrained by the limits of its information. Even after Ptolemaic maps were surpassed by more accurate charts during the Age of Exploration, they remained objects of fascination. Scholars admired their beauty, their mathematical structure, their historical significance. They copied them, studied them, debated their origins. And today, when we look at them, we see not only the world as ancient Romans imagined it, but also the foundations of modern scientific thought. The Ptolemaic maps remind us that mapping is an act of imagination as much as observation. To map the world is to impose order on chaos, to create meaning from vastness, to trace the edges of the known and push them outward. The maps reveal humanity's eternal desire to understand, to measure, to locate ourselves in the universe. They stand as monuments not to perfection, but to aspiration. They whisper that even flawed knowledge can move the world forward. Even imperfect measurements can shape destiny. Even incomplete visions can lay the groundwork for future exploration. And so when you look upon the Ptolemaic maps, you are not simply seeing ancient geography. You are seeing the mind of humanity in motion. You are seeing the beginning of a long journey that continues today, from Ptolemy's coordinates scratched onto parchment to the satellite images that now circle our planet. These maps are the bridge between ancient thought and modern science. They are the foundation upon which centuries of cartography were built. They are a testament to the power of reason in a world still full of mystery. In the end, the Ptolemaic maps are more than historical artifacts. They are philosophical documents. They remind us that the world we inhabit is always shaped by the way we imagine it. They show us that the desire to map the earth is inseparable from the desire to understand our place within it. And they invite us, across 2,000 years of history, to continue the same quest, to keep exploring, measuring, questioning, and searching for the edges of the unknown. Map number 1. The Babylonian Map of the World. Imago Mundi. If you travel back far enough into the deep shadows of human history, past the age of empires whose ruins still stand, past the kingdoms remembered through legend, past even the civilizations whose names echo faintly in dusty chronicles, you reach a time when the world was not yet a place to be measured, not yet a place to be calculated, but a place to be feared, revered, interpreted, and drawn only through the fragile lens of myth. And in that distant era, in a land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, a land where writing itself was born, where laws were carved into stone, where ziggurats touched the sky like man-made mountains, there existed a small clay tablet, unassuming, cracked, barely the size of a human hand, that captured the earliest known attempt to draw the world. This artifact, known to us as the Babylonian Map of the World, or the Imago Mundi, stands not only as the oldest world map ever found, but as a window into a moment when humanity first attempted to comprehend its place within creation. To look at the Imago Mundi is to witness the moment when cartography itself was born. It is not impressive in size. It does not dazzle with color. It does not contain the precision of later civilizations. Instead, it sits in the palm like a relic of innocence, a clay tablet impressed with cuneiform script and simple geometric shapes. Yet its humble appearance hides an extraordinary truth. It represents the earliest time in which humans took the chaos of the earth and attempted to give it form. The map was created somewhere around the 6th century BCE, perhaps earlier, during the Neo-Babylonian period when kings such as Nebuchadnezzar II ruled from great walled cities and the ziggurat of Etemenanke. The inspiration for the later tale of the Tower of Babel rose above the plains. The Babylonians were masters of astronomy, mathematics, and administrative record-keeping. They observed the stars with a precision that astonishes scholars even today. They calculated celestial cycles. They kept tablets of eclipses. They imagined the heavens as an ordered system. And it is no surprise that a civilization so attuned to cosmic patterns would also attempt to depict the earth beneath them. The Imago Mundi consists of a circle, the world, surrounded by water, the bitter river, the cosmic ocean that Babylonians believed encircled everything. Inside the circle lies a cluster of shapes and wedges representing cities, mountains, and regions. At the center of the map sits Babylon itself, drawn larger than any other location. Not because Babylon was geographically central, but because it was spiritually central. To the Babylonians, their city was the navel of the earth, the axis mundi, the place chosen by the gods. Every river, every region, every land on the map radiates outward from Babylon, as though the entire world were organized around this sacred city. Above Babylon lies the Euphrates River, carved as a straight vertical line cutting through the center of the tablet. To the Babylonians, this river was both lifeline and symbol, nourishing the land with its annual floods, shaping agriculture, trade, and myth. The map captures not geographical precision but cosmological meaning. Rivers are drawn not to scale but to reflect their role in ordering the world. Other cities appear as small circles or wedges with cuneiform labels: Nineveh, Susa, Urartu, each placed not according to mathematical distance but according to cultural significance. The map blends memory, myth, and geography into a single cosmological diagram. It is a world both real and imagined. But perhaps the most intriguing elements of the Imago Mundi lie outside the central circle. Surrounding the world are 7 or 8 triangular shapes, regions or islands, each representing distant lands separated from the known world by the cosmic ocean. These were not literal places, they were mythic boundaries. They represented the edges of the possible, the borders between the known and unknown, where creation blurred into chaos. For the Babylonians, the world was not indefinite. It had edges, and beyond those edges lay mystery. The triangular regions depict a worldview in which the earth was not an open, expanding sphere, but a finite disk surrounded by divine waters. The fact that these outer lands are drawn in exaggerated size compared to the central region reveals how the ancient world perceived distance, not mathematically but symbolically. The farther from the center, the more mythic the land became. In this sense, the Imago Mundi is not simply a map. It is a worldview made visible. It reveals how the Babylonians interpreted their place in creation. It reflects a universe governed by gods, shaped by cosmology, and structured around the belief that order radiated outward from Babylon. What we call a map was, for them, a diagram of existence. Yet the map is not entirely mythological. It also contains genuine geographic knowledge. The placement of Mesopotamian cities reveals an understanding of relative location. The centrality of the Euphrates reflects real geography. The depiction of the Persian Gulf at the bottom of the circle, extending downward beyond the world, shows awareness of the sea's existence beyond Mesopotamia. But every geographic detail is filtered through symbolism. The physical and the mythic coexist seamlessly. To imagine the creation of the Imago Mundi, one must picture a Babylonian scribe sitting at a clay-covered desk, stylus in hand, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. He draws a circle, an act of cosmic significance. The circle was a symbol of perfection, of order, of divine creation. He inscribes cities not to scale but in proportion to their status in the kingdom's cosmology. He marks the Euphrates, the mountains, the marshes. Then he presses in the triangular regions, places not merely unknown, but unknowable. Each inscription reflects a worldview in which the gods shaped the earth and humans lived at its center. The map is therefore less a physical representation and more an attempt to impose meaning upon a world filled with uncertainty. The Babylonians believed that to draw the world was to understand it, and to understand it was to partake in divine order. The Imago Mundi is thus both a geographical and spiritual act. When archaeologists discovered the map in the 19th century near Sippar, in modern Iraq, they were struck not only by its age, but by its simplicity. Yet its power lies precisely in this simplicity. It compresses the ancient worldview into a single, coherent image. It is a map made not by explorers, but by philosophers, not based on measurement, but on cosmology. This makes the map profoundly human. The Babylonians answered this question through myth, placing themselves at the center of a world infused with divinity. And even though modern maps appear entirely scientific, the human tendency to place ourselves at the center of existence has never entirely faded. As you contemplate the Imago Mundi, you begin to feel the immensity of the moment it represents. This clay tablet, fragile and cracked, contains the echo of the earliest cartographers, the earliest storytellers of the earth. It is the ancestor of every map that followed. Without this impulse to represent the earth visually, later maps, from Greek cartographers to Roman surveyors, from medieval monks to Renaissance navigators, might never have existed. The map also reveals the first attempt to conceptualize the unknown. The triangular regions represent humanity's earliest encounter with mystery. They acknowledge that beyond the known world lie lands we cannot grasp. They remind us that the desire to map the world has always coexisted with the understanding that the world cannot be fully mapped. The Imago Mundi teaches us that mystery is not the enemy of knowledge. It is the beginning of knowledge. Even today, when satellites photograph every corner of the globe, the Imago Mundi carries a message that feels strangely modern. That a map is not merely a depiction of land, but a reflection of how we see ourselves. The Babylonians placed their city at the center because it was the heart of their identity. Medieval Europeans placed Jerusalem at the center for the same reason. The Kangnido Map placed China near the center. Ptolemy's coordinate system placed the Mediterranean at the center. Every map reveals not just geography, but psychology. Thus, the Imago Mundi becomes a mirror. It shows us the ancient world, but it also shows us ourselves. It reminds us that humanity's earliest instinct was not just to survive, but to understand the universe and our place within it. It whispers that even in a world filled with fear and uncertainty, ancient people dared to draw the earth, to define its boundaries, to declare that meaning could be pressed into clay. And it reminds us that the birth of cartography was also the birth of human curiosity. In the end, the Babylonian map of the world is more than a small clay tablet. It is a turning point in human consciousness. It marks the moment when we began to imagine the world not as a mystery, but as something that could be organized, described, and interpreted. It marks the beginning of the human journey from myth to measurement, from symbolism to science, from imagination to exploration. It is the first footprint on the long road that led to the great maps that followed. The Ptolemaic maps, the medieval atlases, the Renaissance charts, the global projections, and the digital maps that guide us today. And so, as we end this journey through the top 10 ancient maps that shaped human history, it is fitting that we return to the beginning, to a small piece of clay created by hands long turned to dust, yet still whispering across 26 centuries that the world, no matter how vast, can be held within the palm of human imagination.